Atholton Church family, and those of you who are watching from different places. We're glad you're part of this family today. My wife has saying that if you aren't really there if you don't put your feet in the water. And so everywhere we go where there's water, she has to put her feet in. And so through the years, if I travel without her, I practice what she preaches. So I have put my feet in the Dead Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, the Jordan River, the Nile River, and in this picture, as you can see, this is in the Sea of Galilee. I've had the opportunity to visit the Sea of Galilee a number of times. And I have to tell you, it's the most pleasant part of the whole experience of going to Israel. It's just such a pleasant area. And I want to tell you about the area in the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. It's near Capernaum. Capernaum was the place where Jesus really called his home in his adult life when he was upon the earth. And very close to there is another spot called Tabgha. And it is, I believe, the area around which John 21 took place. Now, it's a very pleasant look on the Sea of Galilee. It's interesting that we have all this rocky shoreline. In actual fact, the Sea of Galilee is probably about 10 feet lower than it was in the time of Jesus. It has to do with all of the irrigation, on all the water they pump out of the Sea of Galilee for irrigation. And so it's kind of hard to envision what the water level might have looked like in ancient times. Right there, sitting on the rocky shoreline of the Sea of Galilee, is this church. It's called the Church of the Primacy of Peter. It commemorates the event that we're looking at in John 21 this morning. It's a rocky beach, you can see, and it's a shallow beach. And just think about the fishermen in the time of Jesus who would have just had these shallow keeled fishing boats that they would have just pulled up on the seashore. There is this church there that's been there since the 3rd or 4th century AD. However, this current building was actually built in the early 1900s. Inside the church is a large piece of bedrock that comes up. And if you can see on the sign in front, it says Mensa Christi, which means the table of Christ. And it is tradition that this is the very stone upon which Jesus served breakfast to the disciples on this morning. We're going to be talking about from John 21. Somewhere along this area, Jesus met with his disciples. This was a beautiful picture on the early morning, the fog still on the Sea of Galilee. And we pick up the story in John 21, verses 1, 2, and 3. It says this: After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, just another name for the Sea of Galilee. And he revealed himself in this way: Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Remember, Jesus had told them when he had left them in the upper room, the second time he had met them, that he would meet them in Galilee. And so these disciples had gone to Galilee to meet Jesus. But as they were waiting, Peter had this idea. Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. They said to him, we will go with you. They went out and got into the boat. Now, it's an interesting thing that Peter does here. He says, I am going fishing. Why? Well, perhaps that's just what he liked to do. Maybe even though he had made a living at it, maybe he actually liked to do it. Or maybe he thought he needed to raise some money. Or more likely, and this is my conclusion, he was struggling with his call. He had had a crisis of identity. He was at odds with Jesus and what Jesus had called him to do. And he was worried. He was thinking that perhaps his denial of Jesus just a few days before, perhaps his denial of Jesus had disconnected him so much from Jesus that no longer could he be a fisher of men. And so the only other thing he knew to do was to be a fisher of fish. So Peter says, I'm going fishing. Maybe he shouldn't have quit his day job. Maybe he had forfeited his calling to Jesus by denying that he even knew Jesus. 3 times he had disconnected himself from Jesus' love by his own life being overwhelmed. You see, Peter was confronted. Are you one of his followers? And Peter had a choice to make. And he chose to love his own life, his own body, more than he loved Jesus. And so he denied him. He loved himself more than his love for Jesus. So Peter said, let's go fishing. And the verse hasn't ended actually yet. It says, Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. And they said to him, we will go with you. They went out and got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. Nothing. Now, when I was a teenager, I used to go fishing every night of the week. Not all night like the disciples did, but I'd go fishing on ponds or lakes, and we'd go out into a fishing boat, and we'd cast our lures down trying to catch a largemouth bass. That's what we wanted. And I've spent as a teenager, many evenings out fishing for largemouth bass. And I understand this saying, that night they caught nothing. It's happened to me many times. It's disappointing. They fished all night. And this had happened before. No doubt it had happened many times before. And so they were probably frustrated and discouraged as they started heading back into the shoreline to pull their boat up on this shallow Sea of Galilee beach line. That morning, as they started their way back in, John continues, just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. For some reason, it seems as though Jesus kept them from recognizing him. And this happened a number of times. The stranger on the shore. And Jesus, even though they didn't know it was him, Jesus said to them, "Children, have you any fish?" They answered him, "No." Does this sound familiar to anybody? And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. Ding, ding. Sound familiar? I like to read a commentator who doesn't believe in miracles. I don't like to read him because of that, but he's a good commentator to read, but he doesn't believe in miracles. And he says in this case that it so happens that sometimes when you're standing on the shore, you can see the fish better than when you're in the boat right beside them. All I got to say is, duh. No way. This is a miracle. And this is not the first time the miracle had happened. I'll remind you, it's back in Luke chapter 5, that when Jesus first met Simon Peter and James and John, Peter had been out fishing all night. And Jesus told him to cast his net. And he cast his net on the other side of the boat, and he caught this huge catch of fish. It happened again now. And the first time it happened, Jesus said to Peter, "Follow me." And what's miraculous is that Peter walked away from that huge catch of fish to follow Jesus. And here it happens again. Cast your net on the other side. And when they do, there's a huge catch of fish. The nets are full of fish. And it's at this time that John has a revelation. Now, I don't know why Peter didn't have the revelation, but John has the revelation. And it says that disciple whom Jesus loved. In the book of John, John never mentions his own name. He calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. Therefore said to Peter, "It is the Lord." They recognized him by the catch of fish. And good old impetuous Peter, he just didn't do anything halfway. It says, when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea and swam to shore. Swam or waded, I don't know how far away they were. And he left all the others to get the boat to the shore and drag the net in. Now, when they all arrived, Jesus already had a fire going. He already had some bread and some fish cooking on the fireplace. And so he invites them to bring some of their own. And then John makes this really interesting observation. I don't know why he does it. I've struggled with this in other times I've studied this passage, and I struggled with it again yesterday when I was completing my sermon. It says that they caught 153 fish. Now, that's a very specific number to catch. And there's lots of speculation as to why it's so significant and why it's so specific. And some authors have tried to spiritualize the number. One ancient church father said it's because 100 was the number of the fullness of the Gentiles, and 50 was the number of the fullness of the Jews, and then you had 3, which is the Trinity, so you have 153. And I want to say, huh? Someone said that the sum of 1 through 17, if you add 1 and 2 and 3 and you add them all together up to 17, then that equals 153. So you have 153 believers who are inspired by the 7 fruits of the Spirit to follow the 10 commandments. I don't know the significance of the number. The most interesting idea I've heard is that in the ancient world, Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, said in his writings that there were 153 different varieties of fish. And perhaps the 153 means that in this net is one of every kind of fish, and it's talking about the fact that the gospel is going to go to the world. It's significant that every kind of fish was caught, and maybe that means every kind of man will also be caught. The universality of the gospel. I don't know what it means. I do know this. If I was a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee and I heard they caught 153, I'd have said, wow. It's like when I went fishing as a teenager and I caught a 6-pound largemouth bass, I'd tell people and they'd say, wow, because that was a big fish. This is the big fish story of the one that didn't get away. And so, verse number 12, Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared ask, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. I really love what Jesus does here. Before he does anything else, they've been fishing all night. They got to be hungry. Maybe their blood sugar's low. Before he does anything else, he feeds them. He takes care of their immediate and physical needs. And then he broke the bread, and they recognized him by his hands. Now, John continues to add in verse 14, that this was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. The first time had been in the upper room without Thomas. The second time had been in the upper room with Thomas. He had said, I'll meet you in Galilee, and this is the third time that Jesus has met with his disciples. So after meeting their needs, after feeding them and taking care of them, Jesus directs his attention to Peter. Simon Peter. Simon Peter, the fisherman of fish, the ex-fisherman of fish, who had become a fisherman of men, who was thinking about going back to fishing for fish because of his denial of Jesus. And so he says to Peter, he says something to Peter. And I've always thought about this, that it was a little bit unkind of Jesus to call Peter out in front of all the other disciples. There are 6 other disciples there. I always thought it was a little unkind of Jesus to call him out in front of them all. I think it would have been better done in private. But then I realized this. His offense, his denial had been public, and so his reinstatement needed to be in public. He had publicly denied Jesus. He had disconnected himself in public by saying 3 times, I don't know him. I tell you, I don't know him. I tell you, I got nothing to do with that guy. 3 times he disconnected from Jesus, and his reconnection needed to be public, if not for himself, for all the other disciples. So they would know where Jesus stood on this reconnection of Peter. 3 times Peter had denied Jesus, and 3 times Jesus will give Peter the opportunity to express his love for Jesus. And so in verse 15, Jesus turns to Peter. It says, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus turned to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He, being Peter, said to him, Jesus, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, Jesus said to him, feed my lambs. Now, this is the first time that Jesus reinstates Peter. It's an interesting thing it's an interesting question to ask. What does he mean by, do you love me more than these? Now, some believe that it depends on where Jesus was motioning. Some think that Jesus is pointing to the fish and to the boats and to the net. And Peter, he says, Peter, do you love me more than these? In other words, do you love me more than that old life? Do you love me more than that lifestyle? Do you love me more than that way of making a living? And it could be that. It could be that. I don't think that's what it is. I think Jesus is pointing to the other disciples when he says that. Peter, do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than Peter, James, and John, and all the other disciples that are there? Do you love me more than these? As a matter of fact, there's one translation, the contemporary English version, that adds, do you love me more than the others do? That's the way they interpret it in the passage. I like this translation, and I like this idea. Jesus is asking Peter, do you love me more than these other disciples do? And the old Peter, the pre-denial Peter, the old Peter would have said, yes. As a matter of fact, he did say that. If you go back to Matthew 26, you have this story of the Last Supper when Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. And then he says, you all are going to fall away because of me this night. And Peter says, though they all fall away because of you. He's talking about all of his other disciples. Though all of them fall away because of you, I will never fall away. What did he just say? I love you more than these guys. I love you more than these. And Jesus said, truly I say to you, this very night before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter says, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. So the answer is yes. Peter, do you think you love me more than these? In the night of the Last Supper, he would have said, yes, I do. These others are wimps. I'll stay with you. I love you more. Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And then when it comes down to it, he has this choice as to make whether he loves his own life or he loves Jesus more. And his love for his own existence wins out, and he denies Jesus. Good words. And without being too hard on Peter, let's be honest, I think he probably believed them. I think he really believed that he was better than the rest of these guys. He'd stay true. He'd stand tall. So Jesus says, Simon, do you love me more than these? And Simon Peter replies, yes, Lord. You know that I love you. You know I do. You know, if I'd have been in Jesus' place, this would have been the perfect time for a zinger. You know, I like zingers. Do you like zingers? You know, we shouldn't use zingers on people. The Lord has blessed me with the slowness to think of zingers 10 minutes after I should have said them. Because it's 10 minutes after I have a disagreement with somebody, I say to myself, that was a perfect comeback. Of course, had I said that on the spot, then it would have been a fight, you know. So I don't often get good zingers, but Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And Jesus should have said, you have a strange way of showing it. But he didn't. He didn't. I'm so thankful. Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, you know I love you. Now, there's something going on in the Greek New Testament that is not immediately evident to English readers. Because most of you have heard of this before. You know, in the Greek language, there's more than one word in Greek for love. In English, we have love. We have lots of other cognate words for love. Adore, cherish, esteem, you're fond of, you regard, you're passionate, you're an admirer, you fancy someone, you relish them, you value them. We have all of these other cognates, but we really only have one word for love. But in Greek, there are these 3 words. You've heard this before. There's eros, which is erotic love, where we get our word erotic. And it has primarily to do with sexual love or passion. In Greek, there's also the word philos, which is a friend kind of love, a deep love of brothers and sisters. It's a human level of love. It's the kind of love that got Philadelphia named Philadelphia, the city of brotherly or sisterly love. Philos. But then you have this word that's really used the most often in the Greek New Testament, the word agape. And most of you have heard of this word, agape. Agape love. This is the kind of love that God loves us with. Now, it's also possible for humans to love with this kind of love, because this is the word that's used in 1 Corinthians 13. So this is the 1 Corinthians 13 kind of love. It is a pure love. This is the kind of love that Sister White talks about in Adventist Home, page 50. Some of you had to memorize this in high school Bible class. I had to. My wife had to. So we know this text. We know this passage from Ellen White. She says, true love, and this is the agape type love, true love is a high and holy principle, altogether different in character from that love which is awakened by impulse and which suddenly dies when severely tested. This is principle kind of love. Now, what you don't see is that 2 of these 3 words are being bandied about in this John 21 passage. Because in John 21:15, when the first time Jesus says, to Peter. He says, Simon, son of John, do you love, and the word that's used there is agape. Do you agape love me more than these? And Peter said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he uses the word philos. I love you with a philos kind of love. It's not what Jesus asked him. It's not what he asked him. Now, the old Peter would have said, yes, I do. I love you with the agape kind of love. My love for you is so strong that I could never do anything against you. And then he denies him. But Peter has learned a lesson. Peter has learned a lesson. No longer will he say that my love for you is a love that can't be changed. But now he understands his love for Jesus is a limited love. Peter's changed. And so he says, Jesus says, do you agape love me? And Peter says, in essence, he's saying, I'm only capable of loving you with a lesser kind of love, a phileo kind of love, a kind of love that we love humans with. I haven't learned to love you with that high and holy principle love. And so he uses philos to describe it. Now, I do have to admit to you that there are some commentators who say that the words are used interchangeably, and so this is not, what I'm saying is not really important. I disagree, because these are the words that John chose to describe this interaction between Jesus and Peter for us to learn about. And so Peter says, I love you with a love that does not yet quite measure up to your love for me, but it's the best I can do. And what does Jesus say? Then feed my lambs. He doesn't say, if you're not capable of loving me with that kind of love, you're out of here. He accepts it. He says to Peter, quit your day job. I've still got a job for you. Feed my lambs. Second time, Jesus comes to Peter and says, Simon, son of John, do you love me, agape love me? And Peter says to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he uses that philos word again. He's not capable of loving Jesus with the kind of love that Jesus loves him. So he's honest. I love this about Peter. He's honest. He's facing his difficulties. And so Jesus says, tend my sheep. A third time. A third time. Remember, Peter had denied him 3 times. A third time, Jesus says to Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. But notice that this time it's different. This time Jesus doesn't say, do you love me with an agape kind of love? Jesus understands that Peter has learned his limitations. And so he says, Peter, do you love me with the best love that you can possibly muster? Do you love me with philos love? And Peter says, yes. You know, Lord, it's paining him. You know that I love you. And then Jesus says, feed my sheep. He's telling him that you are not disconnected from me, but I have reconnected you to me. This is just beautiful. The everlasting grace of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. How else more wonderful a way could Jesus, without scolding Peter, have reconnected him? You know, as parents, all of us have had to deal with erring children. Children who have done things that they shouldn't have done. And then proven that mom and dad actually did know best. You know, I've had my children have done things that I told them they shouldn't do, but they chose to do it, and it went badly for them. And so when they come back, you have to reconnect them. You have to accept them back. You have to forgive them. But I'm afraid that in my human capacity as a father, I don't always do so as graciously as Jesus did. This is one of my favorite questions for one of my children who have done something that I didn't want them to do. My favorite question is, sure, of course we forgive you, but what did you learn from this that will be valuable for you in the future? Parents, if you don't know that one, it's a good question. But based upon Jesus, don't use it. Jesus doesn't scold Peter. He doesn't condemn Peter. He gives Peter an opportunity to express his love for Jesus. Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? And the question is one that every single one of us have to ask. Allow Jesus to ask us. He says your name. Do you love me? Let's admit it. We've all played the Peter role. We've had great plans, great expectations, intense commitments. Maybe it was at your baptism or a week of prayer or at a revival service or at a series of sermons about reconnecting. The Lord reaches our hearts and we make a powerful commitment. We've all done it. But have we always followed through? You know, the problem with New Year's resolutions is that there's not just one day in the new year. The problem with New Year's resolutions is there's 365 or 6 days to try to keep them. And it's hard to follow through. So I find it difficult to be too hard on Peter because it's so easy to see him in myself. What did Jesus ask of Peter when he accepted him back? Simply this, his love. And you know, in Scripture, we have people talk about what is the definition of sin. And most of the time when you ask someone, what is the definition of sin? They will give you 1 John 3:4. Sin is transgression of the law, and it is. But let me suggest to you an alternate version, an alternate definition of the word sin. Sin is whenever we love ourselves or what we want more than we love Jesus. Sin is our failure to love Jesus more than ourselves. And so we know if we love Jesus what we should do, but because we love our own desires, we love our own passions, we love things that we know aren't good for us, sometimes we choose to follow sinful things because we love them more than Jesus. Would we admit that? No, we wouldn't. But our choice of something else instead of Jesus is the basis of sin. And it all boils down to a problem of love. Sin is the failure to love Jesus as much as we love ourselves. And that may be hard to admit. And so Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? We've been talking about being reconnected. And it's been a hard year. And because we haven't been meeting all the time or because of various things, some people have become disconnected. I imagine there are some people who were very faithful about watching our broadcast every Sabbath morning and then got bored with it or tired of it and, well, I'll just sleep in a little bit. I'll do something else this morning. And they slipped away. And, of course, those people aren't watching right now. But so many times I've seen people have become disconnected. But here's the good news. Jesus allows reconnections. Jesus wants reconnections. He invites you. He asks you this morning. He says your name. Frank, do you love me? Do you love me? Well, Peter learned his lesson. It continues on, this conversation with Peter and Jesus. Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, this is to Peter, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you're old, it's looking into the future. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. Verse 19 says, this he said to show by what kind of death he was going to glorify God. And we know history tells us that Peter was also crucified, but he refused to be crucified like his Jesus, like his Lord, and so he requested to be crucified upside down. You see, the first time they had asked him, do you know this guy? And he had denied them because he loved his own life more than he loved Jesus. But this time he had learned his lesson. He had reconnected to Jesus. And this time he loved Jesus more than his own life. He had learned his lesson. He had reconnected. And this time he would not have boasted about it because he was a changed man because of the love of his Lord. And he said these words to Jesus. He said these words to Peter. There are words that he had said on the Sea of Galilee on the very first day he had met him, that first day with the miraculous catch of fish. That first day he had said to him, follow me. And Jesus said it again. And Peter never ceased to do so. If you've been feeling disconnected, Peter is the perfect example of what Jesus wants to do for you. And he invites you to follow me. No matter how disconnected you become, Jesus allows reconnections. He did then. He does now. And he will always until the coming of Jesus. So today I invite you to follow Jesus. As we sing this morning, we're going to sing just a familiar chorus that we want you to join us in.